click go
Uh-oh.
live,
Okay.
and then
Right at the right moment. Yeah.
as we go live, we're going to be doing this, and people are going to be wondering what the heck is going
What the
on.
heck?
Um, the heck that's going on is I was just sharing with Darren. I've got a bit of a migraine headache, and he was pointing out some pressure points here that might be helpful. But eh, eh, anyway, um, so now that I've just shared with the world what's going on, if I seem somewhat subdued at points, it's probably because I'm going, ow. Anyway,
uh,
so yes, we're live. Welcome everyone. Welcome to this will be
Hello
episode
there.
446 of For Mac Guys Only. This is the recording session, as we've talked about before. This is just kind of the everything that happens behind the scenes as we record the audio episode of For Mac Guys Only. And oh dear, I just realized I didn't plug in my Ethernet cable.
Oh, just realised my video is blown out a bit. I might be able to. Oh no, it's worse if I do that. Let's change that back again.
Yeah, I think you might have a light or maybe the sun coming in on the
Yeah,
like
yeah, that's it.
bouncing off
Yeah,
your cabinet or something.
that's right.
Yeah, but there you go. Hmm. Someone has joined in our chat room, which is awesome. Always great to see you folks in there. Um, so for if you've just turned in, you missed all the pressure point stuff we just did a minute ago. All right. Anyway, um, uh, anyway, recording session for episode 446 of From Mac Guys Only. Darren and I were just kind of doing a little behind the scenes rundown of the show, and we'll see where it takes us. Anything going on in your world, Darren, that
Um,
we need to talk about, or anything you want to talk about in particular in this episode?
Not really. Well, not that I was thinking of. I've got a nice bit of a break coming up. I've managed to wangle taking off every Thursday and Friday for the next month, so I'll be on 3-day weeks for a whole month. So
Wow.
nice.
Wow. We may have to do extra episodes then. We have to
Oh well,
record.
yes, potentially, yes.
Oh, you mean you actually want to use those extra days for like a holiday or something?
Perhaps.
Okay. Well, I feel like we could probably get started with the episode if you're ready.
Why not? Yeah, yeah. Let's
This will
go
be a
for it.
record. We're only a whopping 7 minutes into the recording here, and we may
Wow,
actually be ready to start.
that's that must be a record.
I think it is. I think it is. Except for the reaction time episodes, those we generally start pretty much right away. But
Yeah.
okay. Uh, by the way, we didn't have a reaction time episode for Apple's event for the iPhone 16e.
No, it
Um,
wasn't really an event, I
wasn't an event.
suppose.
There was nothing really to talk about. They introduced the 16e. Cool. Um, we kind of traded a couple emails about that. Did you have any thoughts on the 16e? Is it something you think you might get?
I think it's because of well, it is obviously going to have a price rise because there's a lot of technology in there that wasn't in the previous
Mm,
SE range.
right.
Um, but I think it's I think the 16e is getting quite a bad rap out there in the review world, massively criticizing the price. But as we touched on,
I hadn't heard that.
yeah, well, as we touched on before in a previous show, I think we went through the difference between price, as in money, and value, i.e., what
Right.
you get for your money. So, and they're often two very different things. And I think people aren't seeing the big picture. And it is actually a very, very good device. Not for everyone, of course.
Right.
That's why there's a range of devices. But for surprisingly, well, a good chunk of people, I think the 16e is a very good a very good buy-in, especially given its longevity and its incredible battery and so on. And yeah, there's quite a few advantages there. I think recently I saw an episode from Linus Tech Tips, who is usually a little bit down on Apple on many occasions, but in this case he was defending the 16E for being overly criticised by other
Mm,
reviewers, and I found
mhm.
that quite a refreshing. His video quite refreshing. It's really good.
You know, when the general blogosphere doesn't get what they think they should get from Apple, these types of criticisms start flying around. And I was on Dave Ginsburg's In Touch with iOS last night, and a couple of great points were raised, things that we discussed ourselves, maybe not on the show, but we
Mm.
discussed in email trading back and forth. And one of those is I think people are making a much bigger deal about some of the features that maybe didn't make it into the 16E that are in the other phones in Apple's lineup, like MagSafe. I just don't
Mm.
see that as being that big of a deal when Qi charging's there. If you
No,
want
no,
wireless charging, you've got it. If you want
exactly.
to mount it in the car, guess what? There are plenty of mounts out there that will work just fine and can even do the induction charging with Qi charging in your car if that's what you want. So MagSafe,
Yeah.
I use MagSafe all the time. I think it's awesome. I love having a MagSafe mount in the car and just going boop and just sticking it right up there. I think that's a wonderful feature. But I also don't think I would miss it that much if the 16E were the phone for me.
No, it depends on if you're you're probably not the intended audience for the 16E, whereas the intended audience are likely to never use Qi charging,
I
and
think that's true.
I've seen quite a few examples of people that don't even know it exists, so they just plug it in, even on a phone with Qi charging. So
They just plug it
so
in.
the
I know. I
intended
see that all the
audience
time.
won't miss what they don't use.
Yep. Yep. And then another great point that was brought up by Marty Gencius on the show last night. Um, his podcast is Vision Profiles, by the way.
Oh,
But
interesting.
yeah, it's a good show. Check it out if you haven't. But another great point that he brought up is that yes, he has a 16 Pro Max. I think he's got top of the line
Top
iPhone.
of the line.
Um, but when he travels for work, he doesn't necessarily want to bring this phone with him.
Right.
He considers it a bit of a theft magnet. He's concerned that it might get swiped. And granted, there are ways to lock that puppy down so that if it is stolen, it's really just a brick to somebody who takes it. But I think it's a
Yeah,
valid
it's not worth
point.
stealing. Well, in theory, it's not worth stealing because the the criminal types, shall we say, will have a particularly bad time trying to get around the
Right,
protections that are in there.
right, right.
So it makes it a very, very bad choice of phone to steal.
However, he said for his travels, he will probably, in fact, I think he said he was going to get a 16E today.
Oh,
That will
yes,
be
yes. A
strictly a
travel
travel
phone.
phone. Yep. So I think
Yeah,
that's a great point. He wants the Apple ecosystem with him, but he doesn't necessarily need his 16 Pro Maxadoodle with him uh, when he's traveling. So I think that's a fantastic point. And then, as I
yeah, yeah.
said, gosh, no, I didn't. I don't think I did say this to you. I think I said it to a listener who is trading emails with me about the 16E, Nick, and
Right.
I believe, yeah, I believe it was Nick, and I said to him, gosh, from my perspective, and this I know a lot of folks don't feel this way, but from my perspective, Apple Intelligence just isn't that important to me. It doesn't matter to me if
Yeah,
if it's
yeah.
on the phone or not. And so to me, if I'm looking at the 16E versus the 15, which Apple still sells, I'll buy the 15. It's $100 more and it's got better camera and uh,
Yeah,
you
yeah.
know. Anyway, so I think that's and not that, $100 here, $100 there doesn't make a big difference,
Well, it
because
adds
it
up.
does. It does make a big difference. But if I'm looking at the 15, maybe I would look at the 16 then. So
There's
I don't know.
the steps, the incremental steps to that. I mean, Apple are good at this. They will
Yeah, they are very
just
good
give
at
you a
that.
small incremental step to nudge you up the ladder a bit.
Yeah,
They're not being nefarious at all, any of that. And they and what they're offering at each step is good value for each step.
yeah.
But they do put you on the bottom of the ladder to encourage you, and then try to although having said that, they never upsell you. I've never experienced an upsell from any Apple
You mean in the
employees or anything.
store? Like if you go to the yeah.
Exactly, in the store, I've never ever experienced upsell, and overhearing how they behave with customers has always been like exemplary. Yeah. So yeah, I got no complaints at all.
I
From
suppose that's true. I honestly don't go into the Apple store that frequently. There aren't any immediately around me. I have to go at least an
oh
hour to
no.
get to one. But yeah, I don't think I've experienced any upsell either when I've been in Apple stores and looking. You know what you're looking at. I think they will question. I think they'll ask you pointed questions to make sure that you really are looking at the correct device, because they don't want you to be returning it
Yeah.
a week later because it didn't suit
Yeah,
your
oh,
needs.
absolutely. If you start a conversation, they're very good at steering you to the correct device for you,
Yeah,
rather than the uh, the model they have on sale that week, or that doesn't bear any relation to what they recommend. They recommend the correct device for you, which is very good.
yeah,
And they also don't pressure you. So if you go into the store and you just want to play with the kit and just have just try things out. They won't come up to you and say, "Oh, can I help you? It looks like you really want to buy one of these." They
it,
don't go down that line. So that
they in,
I think
they
that they're
they
much
encourage
nicer than
playing.
a lot of other stores. Yeah, they encourage
Yeah,
playing, exactly, and
yeah,
that's healthy. Yeah, I mean that's the best way to find out how good whether a device fits in with what you may want to switch to, perhaps sometime.
I was just going to say, interestingly, that very concept plays nicely with our topic today. So maybe we should get started. We are
Cool.
now 13 minutes in, and we'll just get going here, I think. I'm not. I think I like this title. I think I like this title. I didn't
Oh,
want
you got
one
a
that
title.
I didn't want one that incorporated the word hate in it. So I
Oh, no, 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 no. That's very,
Yeah.
yes.
So I
Uh,
went a different direction, but we'll see. We'll see.
cool. I'd be
All right.
surprised. I don't know what it is.
You don't know what it is. I know you don't know what it is. All right. Here we go. Here we go. In three, two, one. It's for Mac Guys Only, episode number 446 for February 28th, 2025. What I like about Mac. Hey everyone, welcome back to For Mac Guys Only, the show for the Mac community where we share our thoughts and opinions on current Mac news and events. And joining me to discuss the Mac Curious is Darren Davies. Hey Darren.
Well, hi there. Unfortunately, I can't give you my Tim Cook hello because I've just looked up the time where I think you are actually, because interestingly, your your location doesn't appear to appear on the World Clock app, which is shocking, isn't it? Shocking.
That's by design, Darren, by design.
I
I
see.
put in a special request with Apple to
Special request.
wipe my location
Anonymity, yes.
off the face of the earth. Yes, that's exactly what it is. No.
So I couldn't say my good morning.
It is indeed good afternoon. How about that?
Yes, it's 15 minutes past one, I believe, where you
It
are.
is. It is.
Excellent.
And remember, if you are joining us live, I'm going to be keeping an eye on the chat room too. So if you have any questions or comments as we move along, be sure to drop it in the chat room and we'll address it here on the show. Darren, you recently shared with me a comment posted on, I think it was Reddit. I'm not
Yeah,
exactly sure where it was. I think it was Reddit, right?
that's right.
Um,
Yeah, I read it.
we'll let your siren pass.
Uh-oh. Uh-oh, they're coming for me. Oh, they've gone. That's all right. They've passed, so
There you
they're
go.
not coming for
Okay.
me after Perfect.
Here we go. We're recontinuing. Sirens passed. Um,
Excellent.
but this comment that you shared with me was from a self-described Apple hater. Now, that's not a term I love, but we'll
No.
talk about that in a little bit. In the comment, though, the poster wrote about their recent experiences switching to the Mac and also a few revelations that they'd had once they had done so. A lot of them were surrounded the hardware, the amazing trackpad that the Mac ship with, the battery life,
Mm,
things like that, the build
yeah.
quality, all things that contribute to what makes the Mac a Mac on top of the software environment. Um, Now, this was kind of a long post, but the gist of it was, and I will admit this is with thanks to the text summarization feature of macOS. They wrote, having been a Windows user my entire life, the thought of buying a MacBook never crossed my mind. And I didn't like Apple's, or so he thought at the time, absurd pricing until a friend convinced me to check out the nearest Apple store for potential options. The me from a month ago, he wrote, would have never believed something like this existed. And the converted part of me now
Yes.
wonders why so many people hate MacBooks when such crazy technology is right in front of us. Now, I think that's a
Brilliant.
fantastic summarization of his experiences. Now, I know that we've had, and maybe we do have, people listening to the show now who are warming to the idea of switching to the Mac. And I certainly would never want to use the term Apple haters. It's such a harsh term. And
It is. Yeah.
I, you
I,
know,
I
I'm,
agree
I,
completely. Yeah.
I'm not even sure they'd be listening to For Mac Eyes Only if they hated the Mac so much. Um,
You never know.
but you never know. You never know. But I have
Uh,
found, and I'm curious your experiences on this too, Darren. I found that those I've run into who might identify with that term have little justification for hating. Either they've never used a Mac, or if they did, it was, I don't know, back in the 90s. And admittedly, the Mac was a completely different platform back then.
that's right.
So
Yeah.
my
Literally.
impressions, literally a different platform, it's changed 3 times over since then. They definitely don't understand the Mac. That's my impression. They don't understand the Mac
Mm,
or what it can do. But there are a lot of folks who might be hesitant to switch to a Mac, and in some cases for very
yes.
good reasons. And in some cases, like with the Reddit post, the concern with switching stems from maybe a general misperception of what a Mac is and what it can do. So I thought we could have a conversation centered around this very topic, and then we'll open it up to listeners. So the kind of general topic for this episode then, Darren, is what might stop people from buying a Mac. Now I know you work in IT. You have a lot of experience with people who use both platforms. What is your what's the first or most important reason you run into when you try to switch somebody from using a Windows PC to a Mac? What kind of hesitations do you
Yeah.
get?
Funny you should say use that word. The main thing is hesitation, um, and I think 90% comes down to familiarity.
Mm-hmm.
So someone that has grown up and learnt Windows, say, for instance, just to pick a random operating system. um,
Completely off the top of your
oh
head,
yes,
just a
just complete.
random.
Yes, exactly. Yes.
Yes.
um, they might have become so familiar with it that they just can't envisage being unfamiliar and having to learn things again. But I would contend, especially now in the current time. Of course, we know Windows 10 is coming to the end of its life,
Yeah,
and some Windows 10 running hardware won't have a chance at all of running Windows 11. So there's a choice there, and when you talk to people who are entirely familiar, say for instance with Windows 10, they still have to learn a fair few new things switching to Windows 11. So why
that's
not
true.
go the whole hog and learn a whole new operating system and switch to the Mac instead?
It's interesting you bring that up because the first two things that I wrote down when I was thinking about what type of pushback I've encountered from folks who I'm trying to convince to switch to a Mac, let's put it that way.
Hmm.
I'm going to just combine these two ideas because one is fear of the unknown.
Yeah.
Different is scary, right? The
Yeah.
idea
Oh,
of switching to something different, especially after, like you said, years and years of using, to pick on Windows as your primary operating system,
randomly, of course.
randomly. Fear of the unknown is a big factor in people's hesitation to switch over to a Mac.
Mm.
And then that kind of ties in very nicely with something else that you said, and that's the break from the familiar, or possibly not even wanting to learn something new.
Yes.
Um,
An unwillingness to learn anything new. Yes, they know what they know, and they like what they know, and they don't want to know anything else.
yeah. And you had a really nice comment about this. You said you referred to this as trying out a Mac and being confused. And
Mm.
I think you said you had a story about your own
Oh no.
confusions. And I'm
Yes,
going to make
I
you
have an
share it here
embarrassing
because
story. Yes.
you, you you had a story about your own confusions when you were trying out the Mac in the store.
This is true, which might help people on the same journey. Yes, this is terribly embarrassing, especially for someone who's um, uh, yeah, quite very familiar with, shall we say, in Macland, and has been now for many years. And yeah, it's all. I'm a convert, absolute convert. Although not exclusively. So I do dabble in lots and lots of different things. So lots of different operating systems, lots of different
And many
things
of
as
us
well.
do.
So it's good,
Yeah.
and many of us do indeed. Um, so for me, just moving to different systems and different operating systems is just an opportunity to learn something new, rather than a downside. But very embarrassing story of my first Mac encounter. Um, and in a way, I do blame the store I was at. So I have a little bit of a mitigating thing going on there. So
Was it an Apple
yeah,
store?
it was not an Apple store.
Okay.
That I shall possibly protect the name of the store to protect the innocent or the guilty. But
Fair enough.
yes,
Fair
what
enough.
what they'd done is they'd locked down, because they couldn't restore the Macs the next day as Apple does, to give you a
Right.
nice user, so you could use the systems and mess around with them, and then the next day Apple will wipe them so they're in a nice fresh state for the next person to come and play around with. Um, this store didn't do that at all, didn't like that, didn't have that policy. So what they did was they locked it down, but they locked it down so much you could barely do anything at all. So my first very embarrassing situation was I couldn't work out the mouse because
Oh,
would you believe?
right.
Um, because I tried to do the equivalent of a right mouse button click, and I thought, hold on, this isn't working. Um, And I did try to look through settings, but obviously I couldn't. It was locked down, so I couldn't ever turn on the right mouse button click, and I didn't know the magic key to give me the right click menu. So I was very confused at that stage, thinking how am I going to use? And I couldn't even try out all the advanced gestures that the Mac had because none of them were turned on, and it was all locked down. So it was a terrible experience. I couldn't figure out all the advanced gestures with virtual desktops and all the clever things that the Mac OS can do, and I didn't know the key modifiers to press just to get any of this to work. So I was completely clueless. And then the second thing was that was even worse in a way was, or slightly less embarrassing, I suppose, is
Slightly.
I tried to find out how to add a new user account.
Oh,
Obviously, that's
okay.
that's that's locked down. I didn't necessarily want to add myself as a new user. I just wanted to see how you did it. So the trouble is, and this is another addition to one of the things that may stop people from um, being comfortable trying a Mac, is the mindset. And this might sound a bit weird, but I very much had a Windows mindset. So
Mm,
when I loaded the
yeah.
application for adding a new user, I was looking around for all the menus in the top of the window, which of course aren't there. They're in the top of the display. So
Right.
there was a disparity there with how menus appear. And being a Windows user at the time, very much only a Windows user, Windows and a little bit of Linux, um, I was there for ages looking through all the menus to try and find how to add a new user. And there wasn't anything there. It wasn't there.
Where's
And
control panel?
well, where's my control panel? So, to cut a long story short, I eventually discovered later on the that my mindset was wrong. I
Mm-hmm.
was thinking like a Windows user,
Mm-hmm.
and in the words of Yoda, you must unlearn what you have learned. So I found out that all I needed to do was press the plus and minus key, which were right there in front of me. Plus to add a user, minus to take away.
Mm-hmm.
Easy. And
Mm-hmm.
and the beauty after finding that out was that paradigm goes through all of the Mac OS's application preferences.
Yeah.
So learning it once with one preference shows you how to approach doing the same thing with every other preference and setting. But at the time, that did actually put me off, and I was thinking, well, I don't entirely know what software I'm going to be using for photography. I don't know what I'm doing. I don't know how to use the mouse, which is all quite a big problem. And I couldn't figure out how to add a user account because I couldn't figure out how the menus worked. So that was terrible, terribly embarrassing. And I'm supposed to know these things. I'm supposed to be an IT expert. I'm supposed to be able to wander up to any computer at all and just know how to use it.
You know, interestingly, most of the folks I would call, and again, not a fan of this term, but most of the folks I would call Apple haters are IT professionals.
Yeah,
And
yes,
they they
they're
have
the
this
worst.
mindset. They are the worst, and many of them are very, very good friends of mine. But they have this mindset because of this muscle memory, because they have learned the Windows environment or the Unix environment so extensively that
Yeah,
there's very little effort, mental effort involved in doing anything on that platform. And now they're
yeah,
faced with a new platform where the mental effort, the mental energy that's required to use it jumps by 100%
at
because
least initially, it's
at
very
least
confusing for
initially.
some people. Yeah,
So uh, your story, you may think it was embarrassing. I don't think it's embarrassing at all because your story very much mirrors the experience of most folks who are new to the Mac, whether they walk into an Apple store and start playing with it just out of curiosity, or whether they take the plunge and buy one and bring it home. there is this
Well, they're taking the
this
plunge. That's the difficult bit, isn't it?
well, that's the difficult bit, but some people do. Some people,
Yeah,
they
yeah.
hear all these wonderful things about the Mac and they just say, hey, I'm going to get a Mac, and they buy it and they bring it home, and then they're faced with the question where to start. And it on the surface, it doesn't seem like it's a difficult thing to adapt to. Yes, the window
Mm.
controls are on the left instead of the right. Yes, there is the fact that Apple doesn't enable secondary click by default. There
Which I
are
think is a
no,
mistake.
perhaps, but it is traditional.
Oh yes,
Perhaps, it goes back to the early days of the Mac when there was only one button.
one button.
Uh, the idea that the mouse doesn't have any physically discernible buttons on it sometimes confuses
Yeah,
people.
could confuse people.
There,
Like,
there's
yeah,
nothing
where's the scroll
to
wheel?
where's the scroll wheel? It's right in the center. I don't see
It's
it.
right in front of you. It's right under
Scroll
your
your finger
finger.
on it. So um, I've mentioned this on the show many times before, but I'm also going to give credit to Jeff Gamet, who mentioned this yet again on In Touch with iOS this week, on last night's episode, in fact. And that is that discoverability is a problem on
Mm.
Apple devices,
Yes, yes.
especially for those who are unfamiliar with the Mac.
But
Unless
then,
you're
so,
sitting down with someone and they're pointedly showing you how to do these different things, it is difficult to discover how to do these things you are used to doing on another platform,
true.
especially when the green
However,
button
if
doesn't
you,
do what you expect the green button to do anymore.
yes, um, I think you could extend that and you could say, what if someone had never used Windows before and they were a die-hard Mac user, or
Yeah.
potentially more likely a die-hard Linux user, and they've never used Windows, which is that would be a very unusual situation, but possible. But you'd be in the same position. I mean, I don't think what we've become familiar with Windows is discoverable either.
Hmm.
So yes, Apple does have a bit of a discoverability difficulty there, trying to make things more discoverable and easier to discover. But I think Windows has exactly the same problem, and it's only because we've grown up with Windows for 20 years that we know all of its idiosyncrasies and strangeisms. We we just know how to get around them.
Well, one, only 20 years. And two,
Well,
um, you, you know, I know we've mentioned this on the show before. One thing that I love about Mac OS, and I'm gonna really say OS 10, but
oh
you can
yeah, yeah,
extend this to Mac OS in general, like even going back to the 80s, is the consistency of user interface. If you were a
yes,
Mac user in the 80s, you can pick up a Mac in 2025 and be pretty familiar with how it works. There's a couple things that are different, but in
yeah,
general, you can pick it up pretty quickly. If you're a Windows 3 user and you jump to Windows 95 and then jump to, oh, let's say Windows 7 and then to Windows 10 and then to Windows 11, there is literally a new learning curve with every major
yes.
version of Windows. And we're not even including Windows 8 in that. So the 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 learning curve, as you mentioned earlier, with Windows 10 coming to an end in October,
Yeah.
there many users are faced with a learning curve. So why not start with another platform? And
Mm.
if we get past the fear of switching to another platform, I think discoverability and the learning curve is still something that people have to face and still, come to grips
Yeah.
with. But it won't be that much different than the learning curve switching to Windows 11. Uh, but that was the whole point of the last few episodes that we've done, Darren. There are
Yeah. Yeah. Ties in nicely. Yeah.
so many awesome features and tools that are just waiting for people to take advantage of them on the Mac. But if you don't
Mm.
know that they are there, the tendency is to just fall back to the familiar. And when you stick with the familiar, you fall back to the familiar. And by that I mean installing Adobe Reader, installing Microsoft Office, installing Google Chrome, installing the tools that you've used on a Windows computer because that's what's familiar to you.
Yeah, you think you
Then
need them, but you don't.
you think you need them, but you don't. But if you feel that you do, because that is what's familiar, then I think the question many people pose to themselves when they're thinking about switching a platform is, why should you go through the hassle of switching when Windows works just fine? Thank you very much. That's the exact same
Ah,
software, right?
but does
So,
it work?
well, that's another episode. But
Exactly, that's a
but
big
that
kettle of
all
fish.
comes
That one.
back to the familiar. So, will it be familiar? Can they make it work the way that they're used to working? And the answer is, of course, yes to both of those.
Mm,
I heard someone the other day using Windows, wanting to switch to a Mac, wanting a portable Mac, and their primary requirement was, and their primary question was, can it run Microsoft Office?
oh, right. Okay. Yes. Because people
Right?
generally have relied on Office so much for Windows
Yeah.
that they think they absolutely need it, and that there's no possible way to use any other computer if Microsoft Office isn't involved, which is wrong, of course.
Right.
Um, but you have the option either way.
Microsoft does a very, very good job
It
of
does.
making people feel as if they are locked into Windows if they want to run Office, or that,
Yeah. Yeah.
yeah,
It's funny that that's one of the things that Apple gets criticised for by people that are reluctant to switch, in that you might be locked into a platform,
mm,
and then I have to remind them that they're already locked in to Microsoft's platform,
yeah.
and they tend to not like it when it's spelled out in a way sometimes.
Okay, this goes directly into my next point, but I do want to
Ah,
mention something that occurred to me just the other day. I was helping someone set up a new Dell, nice computer, Dell Latitude notebook computer, nicely built.
nice in
Uh,
quotes, nice.
Similar, no, well, no, I think it really is a very nicely made computer. It would make a wonderful Linux device. And by the way, you can buy a Dell with Linux preloaded on it. I should just
You can.
mention. Um, Now, uh, I'm not arguing Dell versus Apple or whatever. That's not the point of the argument. It was a nice computer,
Yeah.
and I'm going to talk
Yeah.
about that a little bit more in a bit when we talk about cost.
Oh
But
yes, yes.
the one thing that just irks the heck out of me with Windows is this lock-in to Microsoft's cloud that they all but force people to
Uh,
sign in with a Microsoft account, and then they
yeah.
tie that account to every single system and resource on the computer. Why?
And
Why are you doing that, Microsoft?
there's a famous IT guy called Paul Thurrott who is
Oh, sure.
extremely good.
Yeah.
Yeah, yeah. You probably heard of Paul. Um, he he's recently been bemoaning Microsoft for not taking notice of preferences.
Mm,
So he would, for instance, set a preference to not use OneDrive, and
right.
then OneDrive would come back and become the default preference and start saving his files to somewhere he's explicitly said he doesn't want to use.
Right.
So his preferences keep getting reset, and they're not taken notice of, which is yeah, that would drive you mad, wouldn't it?
And I did notice, speaking of OneDrive, I noticed that the version of OneDrive installed on these brand new computers seems to be missing the feature to not load on startup. It used to have a very nice preference in it
Oh
to
yes, well,
not load
Microsoft
on
don't want
startup.
you to not load it.
Exactly, exactly. And now, conversely, you might say, well, Apple has iCloud, and they ask you if you want to sign into your Apple
That's
account, and
right,
they
but you can
tie
sign
that
into
to
each
your
service separately.
yep, and you're syncing everything to the cloud and all that, but you have a choice. You can opt to not sign into it. Yes, it's teeny tiny little text, but you can say, skip this for now. You don't have
Yeah.
to do it. In fact, you never have to sign into an Apple account. And yet, with a Windows computer, the way to get a local account is to
Is
literally hack the
painful.
installation process, the out of the box experience, the OOBE, the out of the box experience. You have to essentially hack that. It's a legitimate command, but you have to hack it to say
You shouldn't
no.
have to.
Yeah, don't require this. Let the person say they don't have internet. Let them create a local account, and really it should just be a choice. Do you have a local account
Yes.
or don't you have a local account? And guess what?
Yeah.
That's exactly the choice Apple gives you, at least for now.
That's it. Oh, you said
Um,
it now. Oh dear.
so let's go back to that idea of misunderstanding the technology or misunderstanding the operating system or the false belief that Macs are locked down and a limited platform. And I think I mentioned this to you in an email the other day, Darren. I kind of feel as if that misperception about the Mac being a lockdown platform might stem from the limited or no experience that people might have with an iPhone, where there is a much more rigid ecosystem. It is essentially, except in the EU now, it is essentially a lockdown platform. And so I do kind of agree with that to a certain extent, and I sympathize with those who don't care for the way that Apple handles things with iOS. I get that. I get that. And I think I shared the example of my cousin. He's a great example. He doesn't hate the iPhone, but he prefers Android because there are tons of apps that he has come to rely upon that just don't have an iOS equivalent because the platform doesn't allow those types of apps to exist. And why does
Yes.
he use these apps? Because he's an engineer. They're specialized apps that, because they're running on Android, allow him to do certain things on a mobile platform that he just can't do on iOS. Cool. I get that. But that's not the case with the Mac. But I think there
Yes.
is a perception that the Mac is just as locked down as the iPhone. And that is
Yes.
a difficult perception to get people past unless you can sit them down and show them that that's not the case.
Yeah. A Mac is not a iPad. And
True.
it, yeah, exactly. Both platforms approach things very differently. As you say, the Mac is more open. The mobile devices are locked down, but for very good reasons often. Say, for instance, um, when you are entering your password on a keyboard and you're using a third party keyboard, the Mac OS will not allow you to type your password into that third party keyboard, because one of the things that the third party keyboard is allowed to do is take anything you enter into that keyboard and process it offline. So that's how third party keyboards work. And Apple will not allow you, when you're entering a password field, to trust that third party keyboard enough to not take over. An Android owner who uses a third party keyboard might be very confused that when they're starting to enter a password, it will switch over to the system keyboard just whilst you
Right.
enter the password and then switch back again. But that's an extremely a good reason for that. It's stopping your passwords leaking out to third parties with unknown security levels on their third-party keyboards. It's entirely sensible. So the fact that some things are locked down for extremely good reasons.
Yeah. Yeah. No, that's very true.
But
It's
but people
interesting
do see it as restrictive, though, don't? Yeah.
they they see it as restrictive, and some of the other examples, and we're not talking about iOS, but since we're talking about iOS, some of the other examples
Oops,
where
sorry.
folks are a little hesitant about switching to iOS from Android, things like you said, the third-party keyboards and Apple's taking over seemingly at random times when there's a very legitimate reason for it to. The inability to set different digital assistants. You know, it's
Mm,
the S
yeah.
lady or not. That's you can use them, but you have to launch them first. Well, what's the point of having it if you have to launch it? You know, there's arguments like that. But in the case of my cousin, it's not that. It's that, you know, there are certain apps that Apple just won't allow on the platform because of
Yeah.
how deeply they need to integrate with the operating system and the capabilities they give the user. Um, that, yeah,
Yeah, I mean, one of the apps that I can possibly is possibly not the one that you, you know from your experience there, but it's uh, for instance, when you're scanning a network, there are iOS apps that allow you to scan wireless
yes,
networks,
yeah,
but they hide certain information
yeah.
from being listed. Whereas the Android apps don't hide anything; they'll just show you everything, warts and all. The trouble is there are downsides to that as well, but people prefer, or some people prefer the fact of being able to see everything rather than seeing more of a hidden list of content for each item that you might find on the network. But again, there's good reasons for it.
And
Not as good reasons, I don't think, as the other example in this case. So I think Apple could do with um, uh, reining back some of the restrictions a little bit. But yeah,
and some of the misperceptions about the Mac being locked down may come down to some of the default settings when you first use a Mac. You know, are you installing apps from the Mac App Store only? Are you allowing third-party developers? You know, there's those kind of restrictions as well. That I have seen, and I've provided my own pushback against the privacy insanity that has been creeping further and further into the
oh
Mac
yes,
recently, and that can be very annoying. But guess what? It's starting to happen on Windows too. All of the sorry, not app, but all of the operating system developers are realizing that this kind of stuff is important to many of their end users. Maybe not all of their end users, but many of their end users, and they're realizing that they need to start letting people know when software applications are requesting
yes,
permission to do
access, yeah,
things with the hardware that the user may not be aware of. And so we're starting to see other platforms provide similar types of privacy alerts, if maybe not quite as intensive as
not
Apple's,
quite as
but
in your face.
you know,
Yeah,
yeah,
Apple's. Yeah. Well, I mean, there was that interview with Steve Jobs, wasn't there, when they were talking about privacy, and they said, or he said, um, you just need to ask the user. You need to ask them every time.
yeah. Well, he got his
And
wish.
there we are. That's what we've got. You are asked every time.
Uh, it.
But that does
Excuse me.
mean that you are more secure. So when you
Indeed.
turn on the camera, say for instance for this podcast, you turn the camera on. Do you allow permissions for your camera to be used by this website that this fellow called Mike sent you
Yep.
a link for? Um, you have to allow every time you are asked, which is good because on other platforms you allow once, often, and you're never asked again, and you completely forget that you've given that permission, and then that website can then just turn your camera on and do anything it likes. Whenever it wants to, so the situation on the Mac is more restrictive, but it's only there to protect you from yourself almost.
And yet I will relate, not that this episode is a pile on Windows episode, but I will relate
No.
an experience I had the other day helping someone set up a new PC in their office. And I told them, hey, you know, you should get one of the OBSBot Meet 2 cameras. They're tiny little cameras, and they can just stick it on top of their display, and then they have a nice camera for Zoom. And so they bought it, and the camera not only has a wonderful 4K, you know, uh,
Oh yeah, yeah.
camera, but it
Good
has a
quality.
microphone built into it. And their computer previously didn't have a camera or a microphone, right?
Perfect.
So get this little camera, stick it on top of their computer, fire up the software. Camera looks beautiful, absolutely gorgeous image. Got that set up in Zoom, but we could not for the life of us get the microphone to work. It turns out that Windows 11 now has a privacy
Permissions,
feature,
just
permissions
privacy,
for
just
the
like the Mac.
microphone. Yep, just like that. But it is no, it doesn't make as much sense from a logical standpoint. I'm not even entirely sure how we got it working. It's not a simple
Oh dear.
flip the little slider. It involved reinstalling the software, uninstalling
Oh
software,
dear.
adding.
Oh
It
no,
was
that's not good.
crazy. I think we rebooted at least 2 or 3 times. We
Oh,
upgraded the drivers for the sound card on the computer. It was bonkers what we had to go through. And on the Mac, you just flip a little toggle switch.
mm.
So while Windows
Well, these are.
absolutely didn't care that my client could be observed with the camera, they certainly cared that they could be heard with the camera. So there you go.
Well, that's another point, isn't it? That uh, it falls into the realm of uh, I can't remember what I was going to say now. Oh, I've lost it. Oh dear.
Yeah, we'll give you 5 seconds to think about it again.
Oh yes, it'll come back.
It'll come back once we start the next segment.
Oh, that's it.
Um,
Yeah, we start the next bit. Yeah.
so let's talk about specific software requirements. What
Oh,
about Windows only apps? What about games? What about other things that might prevent people from making that switch over to the Mac? And I guess I'd have to start by saying it's hard to argue with the sheer volume of software that's available for Windows.
absolutely.
Windows has been it's been the de facto business and personal computing environment for roughly what 60% of the market, rough 60 70% of the market, something like that, for a good
Yeah.
30 plus years. uh,
Yeah. Hard to
so
ignore.
yeah, it's hard to ignore, and of course there's going to be this ginormous library of apps, and many of those apps will have never seen the light of day on a Mac.
Hmm.
So if you are locked into a specific vertical software application and there's no Mac equivalent, what are you going to do?
I mean, firstly, if someone thinks they're locked into they must use a particular app. Often that's not true, and either there's an equivalent Mac app or even the same app available. Um, and that's particularly true in like science backgrounds as well. So, for instance, you often find that the Windows version of a piece of software that a scientist uses that they think, oh, there's no possible way I could move to a Mac because I must use this software. And you then talk to the company that makes the Windows software, and they say, "Oh, we develop everything on Linux anyway, so we
Exactly.
only port we port our Linux version to Windows, and that's the version you see. But what we actually develop on is closer to the Mac in the first place. And you can often find there is a Mac version; they didn't realize that there was one, or that you can directly run the Linux version on the Mac as well. You have like every option you could
Sometimes.
possibly want.
Yeah.
Oh, not every time, yeah, but
Yeah.
often, especially in the scientific community, a lot of the science apps are developed to be Unix based.
Yeah. That's true. Yeah. And I'll say the science community is perhaps a bad example in this case,
Oh, quite
um,
possibly because they're not.
because they very often do support Linux and Windows and Mac, and
Oh yes, they're quite open, but
probably also
some of
support
them
the
are
Scion.
Windows environments. Sorry, some of them are locked into Windows environments because of where they operate, and they don't often have a choice, even though the software is available.
Yeah, I wouldn't be surprised if some of those scientific apps are available on the Spectrum. You know, they're so many of them were developed ages ago, and anyway, um, but there are some examples of apps that even if there is a Mac equivalent, just don't work the same on the Mac.
Mm.
QuickBooks is a fantastic example of that. Despite
Yeah.
the fact that QuickBooks wants to move everybody to the cloud, which would
Well,
solve the
exactly.
problem, that would solve
It's
the
the cloud
problem.
version.
If you are using the desktop app, the ability to use it in a multi-user environment or a production environment just does not exist on the Mac. Or if it does exist on the Mac, it doesn't allow you to interact cross-platform. So
Mm.
that's a problem. Another good example is CorelDRAW. While it
Yes.
did exist at one point on the Mac, if you are someone who's been using CorelDRAW on Windows for ages and you have this library of CDR files,
Oh, yes. Yes.
very difficult to bring those forward to a Mac. If you can discount them, if you can get rid of them, fantastic. If you can start fresh, wonderful. But if you have this giant library of CorelDRAW files, it is a much more
Historical.
difficult
Yeah. Yeah.
task to bring those over to a Mac. Despite the fact that conversion tools exist, there just isn't an easy way to do it. Let's just put it that way.
That's true.
So there are good concrete examples. I remember one person who absolutely loved this, and this was for personal use. Cross stitching, like
Oh,
needlepoint
yes.
cross
Yes.
stitching.
Absolutely. Yeah.
Yeah,
Yeah. Yeah.
I knew somebody who had a needlepoint or cross stitching app for Windows, and I looked, there was no
There's
functional
nothing.
equivalent on the Mac. And there may be now. This was quite some time ago, but there
Yeah.
was
Yeah.
no functional equivalent on the Mac. Now, she did end up switching to a Mac, but always regretted that she could never run this app once she did. And I always felt bad.
Uh,
I gave her other ways to do similar
well, yeah.
things,
There's
but
potentially other workflows that don't involve the particular app you think you must
yeah,
have.
but it
Sometimes
wasn't that
there's
app.
other ways of working. No, exactly. But
Yeah.
it's just sometimes you're stuck in a particular workflow that you just become used to, and there are other ways of achieving the same thing, potentially with either another app or another combination of a
Hmm.
couple of apps. Um, but people may be stuck in a workflow that they've just gotten used to.
Yep. And
Well, what you were saying about file formats is particularly interesting, because that I think that is one of the reasons that people might not be too keen to switch if as you say, they've got a big library of in, what they would perceive potentially as incompatible file formats. Because back in the day, I used to one of the jobs I did quite a long time ago now was a bit of media magic. I was doing media repurposing.
oh,
So
interesting.
the idea of that was all of the file formats that you had that were specific to a particular app or a particular platform could be converted and repurposed to more file formats that could be more generally used across platforms and across lots of different apps. So I would regularly do quite a lot of media repurposing, especially in the graphics side of things. So it's all possible, but that is something that could put people off. The uh, uh, the file formats they're used to creating um, not being available on another platform. But
Hmm.
the same thing could still happen in their own platform, just with the march of time. So perhaps you have your big Corel library, but say in 5 to 10 years, nothing on the platform you use will load it anymore. You're still in the same problem. You still have to
Yep.
convert your media.
No,
So
you're right.
it's not necessarily a platform switching issue at that point. It's more of a what do I do with my data and how do I maintain it?
Yeah, and two more examples popped into my mind that do not exist on the Mac and are not impossible to convert, but more difficult to convert, and that is Microsoft Publisher and Microsoft Access. Those
Oh,
are,
access is the bane of my life.
there you go. See? And while there are ways to open and convert those databases on a Mac
Oh, yes.
in arguably better database applications than Access, and it's not hard to argue that there are plenty of better desktop publishing apps than Publisher. Pages is better than Publisher in my book, but
Oh, yeah,
uh,
yeah.
get
But
Affinity
it
Publisher or
won't
something
load your
like that.
publisher files.
Yeah, but um, those are two examples where there isn't a functional or a direct equivalent, but it's easier to convert the data once you've come over. So I think what we may be saying here is that if there is some hesitation about switching because you have applications that are specific to the Windows platform and you're worried about bringing them over, talk to somebody who's worked on the Mac for a while
Oh, absolutely,
and
yes.
is willing to put a little effort into helping you figure out the best way to bring those files forward
Mm.
and perhaps help you determine if those files need to be brought forward. So,
Yeah, exactly. Yeah, I mean, we did have this issue back in the day whereby you'd have data baked into a file format, and if only the people that created the original work at the time kept all of their individual assets, those assets could be used to recreate that work very, very
right,
easily. But
right.
because they didn't keep those assets and they only have that one baked in example, you have to try to unpick it and try and get those assets out of this file to try to reuse them. Which,
And by the way, if you have publisher documents, you can open many of them up with LibreOffice. Just
you
saying.
can.
Just saying. Yeah,
And then you can export those into encapsulated PostScript files, and then they become
that's right.
portable, and you can do all sorts of
That's right.
things with them.
Actually, that's a good way to approach it too. If you can mass convert, you could do it one at a time, but if you can mass convert your publisher files to PDFs, Affinity Publisher is a fantastic tool to open up those PDFs and
Oh
edit
yes,
them and then save them out in new
yeah.
formats. So that's another way to around it. But let's get on to something that I know is of a particular passion to you, and that's gaming. This is why you
Yes,
came on the show the very first time. We had you on to talk about gaming on the Mac, right?
yeah, yeah,
And there are plenty of serious gamers out there, and they are genuinely going to hate Mac OS and the limited number of top tier games that are available for it. Now, you can argue all you want, Darren, that things are changing, but they're not really changing that rapidly. And if you are a
well,
serious
yes,
gamer, the Mac is probably not the platform to be on. So that may be a case where someone might self describe as a hater, but they're describing as a hater because they want to run this game that just doesn't exist on the Mac.
yeah, yeah. I think the term hater, as you know, well, we don't particularly like the term,
No,
either of us
no.
really. But I think that the term itself is bandied around a bit too much. So, for instance, say, for instance, someone would give a legitimate criticism to maybe Apple or the
Right,
Mac itself, or
right.
Mac OS, which is a fair criticism, which you can then answer with, "Oh, here's what you can try, and here's what works nicely." Um, they're often labelled by some as a hater when actually they're just asking a question.
Right.
So often I think that the term hater is bandied about far too much to people that don't deserve to be labelled haters.
True. True enough. Yep, that's a very good point. Very good point. Um, and we've talked about some of the ways you can work around it. Um, Truth is, if you're going to set up a Windows computer and you're going to uh, uh, screen share into it, to play your games, or you're just going to set it
Yeah,
up in
that's one
parallel
option.
to your
Yeah, yeah,
Mac, or maybe you're going to set up an Xbox or a PlayStation or something like that and use that for your gaming
yeah.
purposes. Or maybe you're going to get a something like a cam link, and you're going to hook your PC or your
Oh
game
yes,
station
say
into your
a
Mac that
Twitch
way.
streamer, say for instance, streaming their games. Yeah, exactly.
All
But
those
often
are
they,
they're rough workarounds. And if your primary goal in using the platform is to game, the Mac may not be for you. I,
well, yeah, it's not the fault of the platform though, as such, because obviously game developers, their primary thing that they want to do is make money, and by selling games developed only for Windows, they make the most amount of money. So, so it's a very difficult situation to. I mean, you wouldn't try to persuade, say, for instance, a competitive gamer um, to be on the Mac as a platform. Um, if, however, they're saying if they're a game developer and they're creating assets for their games
mm,
and doing multi-platform development
they're
work,
probably on a
uh,
Mac.
you're probably already on a Mac,
Yeah.
exactly. But that is the ideal platform for that, and
Yeah.
essentially, in a way, that is still a gaming angle, but not to the end gamer themselves. So I do, yeah, I agree that sometimes. The Mac isn't the perfect platform for absolutely everyone. And if you are a competitive gamer, mind you, I do know some competitive gamers that wouldn't even touch a PC that doesn't have a 240 hertz display. So they can be a bit elitist, shall we
Persnickety.
say? Persnickety, that's a good word. Excellent. I like it. Yes.
I do want to talk about cost or perceived cost because that is actually a point that
Cost.
was brought up by this poster on Reddit that started this conversation. Um, but before we get to perceived cost of the platform versus other platforms, were there any other points that you would like to raise before we wrap up on that?
Oh, this is where I might have to read my notes. Oh, no, I think I did actually mention actually the being unaware of the benefits of what you can get when you do switch. So, so as you were describing all the downside, well, several downsides of what you had to do with Windows, and you had to go back and forth with
Oh,
drivers
yes.
and so on.
Yeah.
Um, those would be perceived benefits of switching to the Mac,
Hmm.
but quite a few people are unaware that those issues just do not exist on a Mac. So it's an unknown benefit in a way. So it's the sort of benefit that nobody markets or actually tells you about. You don't know that it's a benefit until after you've become a Mac switcher. So it's a little bit too late by then. You've already switched. You already know.
Right.
So I don't know what we would suggest to Apple, say for instance, to say. Um, I mean, do you remember the Mac versus PC adverts? I
Of
know
course.
some of
Of
the
course.
uh,
Yeah.
big favourites of mine. I really liked them, although they were criticised quite heavily in
Yeah.
some areas. But they did do this thing of showing people what the benefits were, and we don't see that anymore. We don't see an easy to understand list of reasons or benefits to switching. uh, I don't see switcher benefits anymore. So that I think that could be something that Apple could make more of. So you won't suffer from driver hell when you're installing a webcam on. That doesn't exist on a Mac. You just plug it in.
It absolutely does not exist because we tested that ObSpot camera on my MacBook
On a
Pro
Mac, and it worked great
just
out
to
of the
make
box.
sure there wasn't a problem with the microphone, and it worked perfectly. Fire up QuickTime, boom, there you go. No permission issues, nothing. It just worked right, literally right out of the box. Hooked it back up to Windows, nada. So yeah, it was an issue. Um, it is interesting to see the face of someone light up the first time you set up a printer on the
Oh
Mac for them.
yes,
They think it's going to be this long, drawn out process. And in some
you
cases,
think,
to be fair,
oh,
it
you turn it on,
is.
oh, it's done.
Some manufacturers make it a little bit more difficult than it needs to be.
Yeah,
But
yeah.
on the most part, or for the most part, you plug it in or connect it to your network, and you're ready to go. And Windows has gotten better at that, but more often than not, the process is much more involved, more time consuming, and when you're done, you frequently don't have a fully working printer. Something's not working, the
Well,
scanner's not
yes.
working, or faxing isn't working, which was actually an important feature to have working for this client the other day. And printing may not be working, or sometimes you get scanner but not printing. It's bizarre. Weird things happen when you try to set up a printer on Windows, but on the Mac, it generally
Anything could
goes
happen.
pretty smoothly. And
Yeah, yeah,
this was the listener question, the gentleman from Australia that we
yeah.
talked about last episode, setting up a printer, remove the printer, re-add it. That generally takes care of most issues.
Usually.
Well, there you go. Usually, for the most part.
uh, for the most part, yes.
Yeah. Now that we've extolled the virtues of how easy it is to set up devices, for the most part.
Well, the only other one I was going to mention was often you see, especially in the reviews and testing videos and so on,
Mm, hmm.
comparing Macs and PCs and so on, there's often an over reliance on benchmarks.
Mm.
And when you look at the benchmarks that they're actually benchmarking, um, they often they don't take enough value in the whole thing. So they're very focused on just testing the CPU, when in fact that's only a small part of the whole experience.
Hmm.
So again, it's I think there's a bit of an over reliance on benchmarks. So this box goes this speed and this box goes this speed, but it doesn't show you anything about the user experience, the support, and all of the other things that often aren't mentioned. And it's all become very benchmark focused, which I don't think is useful for people, um, normal people out there thinking about just switching to another platform or using their existing machine, and what it would take to upgrade. All of those questions, they get confused and put off by the over reliance of benchmarks. I don't think benchmarks are particularly useful.
I agree with you. Looking at benchmarks when you're considering a switch from a Windows platform to the Mac is not a great way to make your decision. It's just not. It even when Macs sported Intel processors and you could do
Yeah,
a as close as possible direct one-to-one comparison between an Intel Core i5 running Mac and an Intel Core i5 running PC, even then the benchmarks did not tell the story because
mm,
as you mentioned, they don't really take into account things like the efficiencies of the operating system, the efficiencies of using the
exactly.
operating system.
Yeah,
Um, it's there's a lot of overhead that Windows places on a PC, and if you want a great example of that, take any 10-year-old PC, wipe the hard drive, and put Ubuntu Linux on it or Linux Mint, and
yeah.
you will be shocked
It'll be
at
10
how
times faster.
amazingly fast that PC runs. And that just goes to prove the the drag
There's
on
bloat there. Yeah,
resources
there's a
that
lot of
Windows
bloat.
puts on a machine. It's crazy, and that 10-year-old machine could have 4 GB of memory in it, and Linux will just laugh. It'll say, "This is
Yeah.
amazing.
It'll say,
I
yeah,
love all
fine. I
this.
got plenty
The,
of room.
I
Yeah.
love all these resources you gave me." And to an extent, the Mac works similarly. Yes, the Mac does perhaps have a little bit more overhead, put a little bit more demands on hardware than Linux does, but overall, it is a much more efficient operating system than Windows for sure. And that's one of the comparisons. Let's talk about real world comparisons. If you're going to benchmark things, don't benchmark
That's
one
right. Yeah.
CPU versus the other CPU. Don't worry
Yeah.
so much about how an Apple Silicon M3 performs versus an Intel Core i9. That doesn't matter. It's amazingly jaw dropping sometimes to see how much faster it might be for the morbidly curious, but it doesn't really tell someone who's a day-to-day user how that machine is going to feel to them when they're trying to take on their everyday tasks.
That's right. Yeah.
So, what do you think? Should we wrap things up on
Oh, we
cost
didn't go.
or
Oh,
perceived
cost. Yes,
cost?
that's the thing I was
Yes.
going to say. We
Yeah.
we were going to jump onto the cost idea. Yeah.
Because that's one thing that the writer of this post brought up, and that was the cost. And
Yeah.
as I mentioned a moment ago, that was definitely true when Macs sported Intel inside. With Apple Silicon, the pricing game has changed dramatically. Um, I mentioned the Dells earlier. I just purchased two new Dell 14-inch laptops for clients. One was an Intel Core i7, one was an Intel Core i5. I said two 14-inch. One was 14-inch, one was 15.6-inch. Um, Otherwise, very similar machines, 512 gig SSD, 16 gig of memory, pretty standard stuff for a Windows 11 running computer. My cost was just shy of $1,100 each. 16 gig, 512 gig SSD. Each of them came with a 3-year warranty, which is admittedly an advantage to Dell. Um, However, that price, that just shy of 1,100, which is wholesale cost, that still puts it firmly in the MacBook Air price range. And
Yes. Yes.
while the Dells are, despite your pushback on this, Darren, while the Dells are very nicely built PCs, and they're serviceable, which is huge. You can
Oh,
open
yeah.
them
Yeah.
up. You can add or replace memory. You can add or replace the SSDs. They're serviceable machines. They
Yeah.
don't
Yeah.
have anywhere near the build quality of a MacBook Air, even
That's
if
right.
they have that ever so slight price advantage. And we're not even yet talking about the Mac Mini, the new Mac Mini.
Oh,
What an
yes. Yes.
amazing value of a computer that it just didn't exist a few short years ago.
Yeah. Although one of the big things that I think tends to shock um, users new to the Mac, especially if they're not expecting it. They hear things about the battery life being good on a
Mm,
Mac laptop, and they don't really realize the difference. I mean, I've been struggling today with, funnily enough, a Dell laptop um, that struggles to keep going without having to have regular trips to a power supply, and
mm, mm-hmm.
you're forever switching between balanced mode, best performance if you can get away with it, or battery extended mode, and then the
Right.
machine slows down to such an extent that it's barely usable.
Just not
So
usable. Yeah.
so the equivalent Mac around the same price, funnily enough, to that Dell, would last well easily 15, 17, maybe even 20 hours, depending on how you use it. And it's like absolute night and day. Um, but they're the same price.
Right. Yeah. Yeah. And while the battery life is shocking because that's probably the most relatable thing, the other eye widening feature of the Mac hardware that I think a lot of people don't take into account is, as I mentioned a moment ago, the build quality, the
Mm.
solid aluminum frame of the Mac.
Macs are made of
The
metal.
the Macs are made out of metal. These Dells were not. The keyboards are so much nicer on a Mac. The key travel is nicer. The Dell keys
Yeah.
wobble a bit. They just don't have that same nice feel that the modern Mac keyboards have. We'll forego the whole butterfly
Yeah.
keyboard debacle a
Glossing
few years
over the
ago.
butterfly debacle. Yeah, yeah.
Just set that aside. We won't talk about that. But
No, we don't talk about such things.
the other shock I think that people experience when they switch to a Mac or use a Mac when they walk into an Apple store and they start playing with a Mac is the trackpad. I have yet to encounter, even to this day, a good, well working, responsive PC trackpad. They just do not exist. They don't exist.
Very rare. Very,
Very
very
rare.
rare.
They're okay. They work fine,
Yeah,
but
yeah, yeah.
they lack the responsiveness of the Mac's trackpad. They lack the functionality of the Mac's trackpad. Uh, and I think that's probably the biggest shocker because when I hear people talk about their laptops, one of the largest frustrations is using the trackpad. They want to use a mouse. They want to get
Mm,
something that they can plug in and, to go back to that term, be familiar with. And that's the mouse. And the trackpads are just frustratingly confusing on Windows computers. The moment they use one on a Mac, like, wow, this is fantastic. I think I can actually use this instead of a mouse. They might want to use a mouse.
yeah,
For example, I'm using a mouse with my MacBook Pro right now because I have other things in front of it that prevent me from effectively using the trackpad. But the,
yeah.
you know,
I did see someone in an Apple store actually request that they were allowed to turn off the Mac because they couldn't believe that it had no actual button.
oh,
So the force feedback was
yeah,
doing its job and tricking them into thinking there's a real button here. I'm actually clicking a real button.
yeah.
And they couldn't believe that it wasn't a real button. So they requested, "Oh, can I turn the machine off?" And of course, when you turn the computer off, the
There's
button
no
response
give.
is,
There's no
is
response.
no,
Yeah,
yes, there is no button.
it's
And it's magic.
that is another thing people don't realize is that this is not a it's not a physical button. It's just
Yeah,
a glass surface.
it's it's all trickery and mind games.
Yep,
Mind.
exactly, exactly. But cost must be something that you run into as you talk to folks and try to nudge
Yeah,
them
yeah.
towards a Mac. Um,
The,
how
the
do you
the
get
cost
around that?
equivalent as oh yeah, the cost equivalence side of things, as you say, with Apple Silicon coming in. Sorry, the cat's coming and doing some very interesting things to the blinds at the moment. um, so yeah, with the introduction of Apple Silicon, um, the cost disparities are are disappearing fast. Often you see equivalency of Mac pricing for the equivalent Mac, and I think some people don't realise what an equivalent Mac would be, and they either overspecify and think it's expensive, or they underspecify and they don't know that they're buying the wrong thing.
Right.
Um, so getting the level right is interesting, but I think there is a legitimate concern in a way because although the base level prices of packs is extremely good, extremely competitive nowadays, sometimes even cheaper than the PC they are an equivalent of.
Especially in the
Um,
last year.
yes,
Yeah.
but the thing that has in the past tripped people over into the oh, it's just too expensive, I can't go there, um, is the cost of memory upgrades and storage upgrades. So Apple are criticised quite heavily for that. So that every time you want to bump up from say 16 to 32 gigs, it costs you like $200 or something.
Yeah.
Exactly, yes. um, and then they think, well, I can just pop down to my local computer emporium and I can buy a stick of RAM for £40. So what is this £200 malarkey? And they don't realise that it's not equivalent. So the equivalent, the memory that they're looking at is in nowhere near um, able to be equated to the type of memory that's in the Mac. So they're completely different. And if you go into it, I did go into this actually with one of my PC fan friends, and explained that if they were to buy, because it is possible to buy the equivalent type of motherboard or similar types of motherboard and specific RAM that is nearly equivalent to the Mac side of things. And funny enough, it costs 3 times more. So we did look up the price, and the
Yeah.
price of doing it on the PC side was £180. So yes, it's cheaper, but only by £20. So Apple
Right.
charge you £200 for 16 gig of RAM, and if you did the absolute equivalent on the PC side of things, which people don't equate like with like often when they're comparing. The cost difference was £20, so it's £180 instead.
Yeah.
I do think Apple would it would be good for them to slightly come down on that price, but it's difficult to explain though to people that it's not the sort of RAM we're talking about isn't the sort of RAM that you get on the stick you just wander down your computer emporium to buy, or it's not the same thing. So you can't compare them.
We we were thrilled to see Apple up the base level of memory on Macs last
Yes,
year. That
it's
was
wonderful. It makes a
huge.
huge difference now. Yeah.
Where Apple is still at a price disadvantage, I think, is with storage. Uh,
Storage is the big one. Yeah, that's the one I was going to come on to. That's where you do come up against a problem where someone in the PC space thinks they need quite a lot of storage. Sometimes it's more than they actually do need.
yeah,
Um, but looking at the price of upgrading the storage on something that they are planning to buy, and they say, oh, I definitely need 2 terabytes. I can't get by without 2 terabytes. And you look up the price, and then they sort of melt and think, no, I can't do that.
it's getting better. It's getting better. But
It's
we still
difficult.
have
Storage is the difficult side of it. Yeah.
storage is a difficult side, and while iMacs, now start with that 16 gig of memory, they
Mm,
still only start with 256 gig of storage, and that just is
yes.
not that's not cool, Apple. You really
Yeah.
got to start
Yeah.
at 512. If you remember, we were at 500 when we still had traditional hard drives.
Mm,
And with the switch to SSDs, they bumped down. And you can argue, well, it's the cost. It's the cost. It's a much higher the cost to put in an SSD is higher than the cost to put in a traditional hard drive. So yes, of course, you're going to put in less. But even the Mac Mini, this 599 Mac Mini is 256 gig of
yeah. Yeah. They're all
storage,
base 256. Yeah.
and I feel as if either they could eliminate that and just start at the 799, and it still would be a good value. But I can't help but think that Apple could make 512 the default standard even at 599 if they wanted to.
That would make things a lot easier because then the base models, the value proposition of the base models then goes through the roof. I mean, there's already been fantastic reports of how well received the Mac Mini is in particular
Mm-hmm.
because of its initial price. 16 gig of RAM, 256. 256 is a bit on the small side, but livable with. Um, but yeah, I think you're right. If Apple could change the base level of storage to 512 instead, like they upped the RAM,
Yeah,
then that would allay most people's fears.
I I can't see any argument against the Mac if they were to do that.
Yeah,
And hardware wise, storage is it. And for goodness sakes, Apple, stick a keyboard and mouse in with the Mac Mini. Come on.
oh yeah, that would be good because they are rather good. Lovely keyboards, but I only get my free keyboard and mouse when I buy an iMac, which is one of the other reasons I quite like to be in the iMac world of
That's right.
side of
Yeah.
things.
Well, the
But
gorgeous
the other thing
display,
to
the keyboard, the mouse. I mean,
oh,
there
oh well,
are
there's lots of things. Yeah,
things.
yeah, the webcam, etc.
Yeah,
There's all sorts. Yeah, the speakers, 6 speaker system, all sorts of things.
yeah, all
But
sorts of
I
things.
think I think there's a big difference to highlight for new users, especially, or people thinking of switching, is the big difference between memory and storage. In that, and this is becoming more popular as well in the PC world, whereby your memory is not upgradable anymore
Mm-hmm.
because of the nature of improving performance and lots of other reasons. Um, so yeah, I think the key is to never skimp on RAM, but you can always buy a little bit of external storage if you need to. So you can
That's right.
skimp on storage a bit, but not skimp on RAM. So the fact that Apple gives us, well, allows us to purchase 16 gig base now models, is good on the RAM side. And even though the storage is a bit limiting, um, you're not you're not totally limited in the same way you would be if you try to scrimp on the RAM side. So you can add external storage very easily, at a very good price as well. So that there are plenty of extremely good drives out there that you can just add as an external little bolt-on to your Mac and save a huge amount of money on the built-in storage cost.
Yeah. What do you think, Darren? Are there any other points you would like to bring up about what might stop someone from buying a Mac?
Um, the only other one I can think of is possibly when the best time to switch is.
Oh, okay.
Um, and there is a very good resource which we might be able to pop in the show notes perhaps. There is a very nice website, which you probably already know about actually, um, which shows you a nice timeline of when Mac products, and services as well, but mostly Mac products, were last updated. So it gives you a
Oh,
nice little readout of when a good time to buy into um, the Mac ecosystem would be, for each product. Like they'll say, oh, don't buy a Mac at this moment because a new one is about to be released for sure in the next 4 months, honestly. Although you could always end up with the situation where there's always something new and shiny on the horizon and you never end up switching because you're always waiting for the next big thing. So
yeah.
I'd say a little bit of both. Don't wait forever because there's always going to be something better on the horizon, but do buy at the right time. So it's a good idea to buy at specific times where uh, when a device hasn't, don't buy a device that hasn't been updated for a very long time because as soon as you buy one, 2 weeks later a new one will come out.
And what might the name of that website be, Darren?
Oh no! Now you're going to ask me what the name of the website is. I got to look it up now. It's shocking. Like, oh, where is it? The Mac Rumors Buyer's Guide. There we go.
Oh, okay. That's not the one I might have thought of. But I tend
Oh,
to
okay.
go, I like Every Mac, everymac.com. I think that's a great site. It doesn't
Well, yes.
quite give the information in the way that you were describing it, but it is a great way to look up the specs and capabilities of Macs from the past and Macs of the present day. And it fantastic site. One of the limitations that they've encountered recently is that Apple has stopped deeply identifying the components of a Mac based on its serial number. So if you have a more recent vintage Mac and you put in your serial number, they're going to say, well, this is what we think it might be. But you don't get all the details that you used to get out of it. But other than
Yeah,
that,
you used to get
every
wonderful
Mac,
detail. Yeah.
one of the great things about every Mac is that it not only tells you when the Mac was introduced, when that model Mac was introduced, but when it was last made available for sale, as well as things like the current street value of that Mac. So if you're interested in maybe
Yeah, for
selling it,
resale. Yeah.
you might get
Yeah.
an idea for what someone may want to pay for it. So everymac.com is a great site for that. And based on the last sale date of certain models, you may be able to determine when is a good time to purchase.
The only other one I was going to mention is for people potentially thinking of switching, um, to remember that Apple themselves have their own refurb store, and there's even other
Mm,
refurb places with other stores as well.
yeah,
But Apple specifically have their own refurb store, which is totally superb because when they say refurb, it's a real refurb. Sometimes they're stripped down. For instance, if you buy a phone on refurb, it comes with a brand new battery. It's not
brand
it's
new
not like
battery.
the battery that was
Yeah,
in the refurbished device. So they refresh everything. They often when you buy a laptop, they've refreshed the screen, for instance.
yep,
So um, the box it comes in is a little bit more bland than the big box you would get from the store, but you can save an awful lot of money, and that money then can be used to bump up your storage. So you can end up with the situation where you can spend exactly the same as you would have spent on the lower storage system, but with more, but for the same money.
On
If
top
you
of
just go to the
that,
refurb store,
go to apple.com, scroll down to the very, very bottom of the site, and you'll see
right at the bottom,
uh,
in really small writing,
really small text. You'll see what is
Apple
it?
refurbished. Or something, I
Rep
can't remember what it says
Apple
now.
refurbished. Yeah, I'll pull up the exact
Yeah,
wording
something
on
like
it.
that.
But one of the neat
Yes.
things about it is that, unlike other refurbs, if you go to a third party site where they sell
Mm,
you a refurbished Mac, uh, it's
yeah,
them
so-called
who have
refurbished. Yeah.
refurbished it, and
Yes.
yes, you're not going to get that new battery. You're not going to get it's not going to come wrapped like it's brand new from the factory for sure. Certified refurbished, that's what it's called in the bottom. It's under
Ah, right.
the bottom menu under Apple Store. Certified refurbished, great place to go. But you get
And you get your year's warranty as well.
the exact same 1 year warranty that you would get if you purchase new, and
Yep.
they qualify
Yep.
for Apple Care. So if you would like to purchase an extended Apple Care
Exactly.
warranty on it, you can do that as well. Um, about the only thing you can't do with it is use your Apple Card to get 12 months 0% financing. With the refurbished store, you have to
Yeah,
buy
it's
it
got to be
outright. Yeah.
upfront cost. Yeah,
Yes.
but
Yeah.
you do get a lot for your money. So the value proposition goes up with the refurb store. I'd say it's wonderful that going in there. It's very easy there as well on the refurb store to find the sort of kit that you're after. So you can subdivide it down to laptop, screen size, etc. And there's even, I mean, for instance, the M4 has been only recently released in many, only a few of the models, but they're starting to appear already on the refurb store. So you
Yeah.
can already buy the absolute very latest. So you're not relegated to only getting older Macs on the refurb store. You can get some absolutely brand spanking new ones.
And not only that, but a really, really good time to shop the refurbished store is the the day and week after new models are introduced,
Oh,
because
perfect.
the
Yes.
refurb store just gets loaded up with previous models Macs.
Yeah.
Um,
Previous Mac.
yeah, it's a great time to buy. One of my favorite stories about the refurbished store was when Apple used to sell iPods in the colored aluminum cases.
Oh, yes.
If they got an
Lovely.
iPod returned and within the 14-day buyer's remorse period or whatever, not only would they slide the guts out of it and replace the battery, but they would slide those guts into a brand new aluminum case. So you wouldn't even get the case that potentially had
Yeah.
scratches on it. You would get a new
Exactly.
case, battery, earbuds, everything
Yeah,
new,
yeah. There's no
except
such
for the
thing as a
guts.
dead pixel. There's no such thing as a dent. Uh,
No,
you will not notice that these you uh, how you think a refurb might look is not how Apple refurbs look. They
no.
look absolutely brand new.
They come out of the box looking brand new. So, those are some of our ideas for what might stop people from buying a Mac. The fear of the unknown, the break from the familiar, not quite knowing where to start, maybe misunderstanding the technology, misunderstanding the operating system. Maybe they have specific software
Not knowing how to use the
requirements,
mouse.
not knowing how to use the mouse, the cost or the perceived cost. But now we really want to turn it over to you. Are you a switcher or are you an OG Mac user? Were you a hater before you switched? What convinced you that the Mac was the right platform for you? And if you've been thinking about switching to the Mac or you've been trying to convince a friend or family member to switch, what's holding you or them back from making the switch? Drop me a line or leave a comment in the show notes for this episode at formaccguysonly.com and let us know. Well, Darren, I think it's time for another essential app. And
Oh no.
You know me. I'm not a big fan of snapping windows on the Mac. It's not. It's one of those things I turn off almost every time. But
Oh,
I
okay.
came across a really cool little free open source app for the Mac called Loop. Now, what Loop
Oh,
is
I heard of that one.
it's a Mac OS app, and
Okay.
its whole claim to fame is to simplify window management. So, snapping, right? Putting windows where you want them
Mm.
on the screen. That's kind of essentially what it does, but it does it in such a unique and easy to use way. I was shocked by how nice it made it to work with windows and positioning them around on screen. The reason it's called Loop is because when you press the little feature key, the key that activates the software, and by default it's the little globe or function key on the keyboard. But if you don't have that, you can set up your own keyboard definition. When you press that key, it puts a little loop on your screen. And you can move your mouse cursor around that loop to the top, the bottom, the right, the left, the top right, top left, bottom right, bottom left,
Oh,
and tell it where you want
I
to position
see.
that window on screen. You can also go to the center of that loop and tell it you want it to be maximized or fill the screen. On top of that, as you are moving your cursor around this little loop in the center of your screen, it gives you a preview, a little grayed out preview
Oh,
of where that window will be on your screen and what it will look like once it's in the new position. This has made snapping much more palatable to me because I don't feel like I'm moving a window and it just kind of pops into place. I can see where it's going to go first. And if I decide that I don't want it to be in any of those places, you can just hover your mouse in the center and the circle kind of grays out, or you can press the escape key and back out of it. But the ability to not only easily choose where you want these windows to be, but to see that preview is
mm.
huge. It's huge. And it just takes a couple clicks and very, very, very great time saver. Now, the one thing about Loop that makes it a little unique, I mentioned that what they call the radial menu, and
Oh,
that's where
yes.
you can just manipulate windows with your mouse or your trackpad. You hold down that, they call it the trigger key, but the key that activates the software, you hold down that key and you move your cursor in the direction that you want to move or resize the window. And then the other unique feature is the preview. That little preview window, as I mentioned, allows you to
Mm.
see
Yeah.
where that window will be on screen before you commit to it. And then it's got a feature that I haven't really taken advantage of, but it sounded really interesting. It's called cycles. And they define cycles as the ability to perform multiple window manipulations in quick succession. So if you press the same key combination
Oh,
repeatedly, or by left clicking
okay.
repeatedly, you can repeat that window manipulation over and over and over again. All very cool. All very cool. But what makes Loop even cooler is that it's completely customizable. If you don't like the defaults, you can adjust the size or the shape or even the color of that radial menu. And you can
Mm.
change how the preview windows look. So if you don't like how the preview windows look, change it. Change the radius, change the border, change the color of them. By default, it takes on your default system accent color, but you can change it if you don't like it.
Oh, that's quite nice. Yeah.
And again, the default activation key or trigger key, as they call it, is the globe function key. But that may not work for you if you've got a full size desktop keyboard or an older keyboard without the globe, like I have.
Well, I was going to say I don't have a clue.
Right? So if you don't have it, you can redefine the trigger key or the
Yes.
action key that starts up
Trigger
the
key. Yeah.
app. Now, because the globe is also the function key, I thought, well, maybe I could just press the function key on my full size keyboard, and that didn't seem to work for me, but it's easy to change. And so what I did is on my full size keyboard, I changed it to Control Shift, and then that activated Loop. So pretty cool. And then on top of that, there are a ton of built in keyboard shortcuts so that you can loop through your windows, mouse or trackpad free. So, for example, you press the trigger key and then press the up or down arrow, it will show you the preview of where that window will be if you move it to the top of your screen or the bottom of your screen. And you can also press the space bar, and I think that will maximize it. But there's just a ton of keyboard shortcuts if you don't want to move your hand away from the keyboard and onto the mouse or trackpad. So that's all really, really cool. And, if you would like to compare what Loop offers versus, let's say, the built-in snapping feature of macOS or any of the other free or commercial snapping apps that are out there, they actually provide a handy dandy little chart of all the features that Loop provides, as well as the features that the competitors provide right on their website. So,
Cool.
if you'd like to check out Loop, it is free, it's open source, and you'll be able to download it with a link in this week's show notes.
Perfect. That
Yep,
sounds really good, actually. It sounds, especially for people that are more visual, because it sounds like a much more visual way of um, managing your windows than the other competitors are. So yeah, that sounds good.
I think that is it. And as I said, that's really kind of, sometimes it takes a little nudge to get me to think about things differently. And seeing this visual loop or this visual, what do they call it? The radial, I already lost the name of it.
Menu,
Radial
radio menu.
menu.
Yeah,
The radial
yeah.
menu. Seeing the radial menu on screen and being able to preview where a window might snap when I select that location,
Mm,
that
mm.
that really made the difference to me. It's kind of like, as we've talked about before, the use of Apple's numbers versus Excel. It's a little bit more visually engaging, and so having that little extra nudge for me made the world of difference. So if you would like to try out Loop, it works great with Sequoia. I was playing around with it on 15.3, so lots of ways you can integrate it with the existing window management tools and even integrate it with Apple's own snapping tools. So lots of great features in the settings. And like I said, it's free to check out and download with the GitHub link that we'll put in the show notes.
Perfect.
Yeah. And I think, Darren, that's going to do it for this episode of For Mac Guys Only. I hope everyone enjoyed it. Remember, we do love to get your letters, so if you have any comments about the show, a tip to share, a software or hardware problem with your Mac, or you would like to share your own switching story with us, you can leave your favorites in the comments of this week's show notes found at formaccguysonly.com, or drop me a line, Mike at formaccguysonly.com. And be sure to subscribe to the show's YouTube channel at youtube.com/FMEOTV and click that little notification bell so you can find out when we are going live. You can join the chat room and catch all the behind the scenes stuff that doesn't make the final cut of the show. And a big shout out to Brian, who joined us in the chat room today. Uh, Darren, what's the best way for folks to get a hold of you?
Wow, I think the best way is to email me at darren@formaccguysonly.com.
I think that would do it. Thanks so much for listening, everyone. Thanks to Darren for joining me this episode. Stay subscribed, and we'll talk to you next time. Bye, Princess.
Cheerio. Oh
I'm not
God.
calling you Princess. I'm calling the little kitty tail. That's Princess right there.
Absolutely. No,
Princess
no,
the
the reason I
cat.
say that is because she's been trying to step all over my keyboard all through this. And she's
Oh,
also trying to get behind the blinds of into the window right next to me and take the blinds down as well.
well, as cats are wont to do. And with that said,
As
we're out,
yes.
everyone. Thanks for watching.
Cheers.